This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Thank you all for coming tonight, and I'm thrilled to talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart, curing the college mental health crisis. It takes a family. As Lori said, mental health can be a tough topic to talk about, and I appreciate all your coming. I am very hopeful about mental health. I have seen people recover from severe mental health problems, being hospitalized multiple times, being suicidal. I've seen students going on to graduate and go to graduate school and lead fulfilling and successful lives. So I want to give you all a message of hope and give you some tools to help your loved one who might be experiencing a mental health problem. But it's very hard for people to address mental health problems on their own, and that's why I wrote, It Takes a Family. And when I say family, I mean it loosely. It can be friends, because we create our own family in our lives. So I want to tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to be passionate about this issue. I'm an associate professor at the University of Florida and associate program director for student health psychiatry. And in fact, I've worked at University of Florida since 1993 in the College Mental Health Counseling Center. I chose to work there right out of residency because I love working with young adults and watching them transform and mature and find out who they want to be. And so one thing that I've seen, though, is a dramatic increase in mental health problems over the last 20 years. And I'll talk more about that later. And I've found myself collaborating more often with parents. In fact, the other day I saw a student who was in crisis, and her parents came up and joined in the session, and we talked about ways to help her. So this is positive that parents want to be involved. And I wrote a book for parents called The Campus Cure, A Parent's Guide to Mental Health and Wellness for College Students. And in order to improve college mental health care throughout the country, I and some other psychiatrists got together and started the Association for College Psychiatry to get the message out there about mental health care and what parents and students can do to get help. Most importantly, as a mother of two millennials, two young adults, and they're 23 and 25 years old, I've seen the pressures this generation of students have undergone. There's much more academic pressure, much more of a push to take all AP classes and get into the best schools. And this isn't coming from necessarily from parents. It seems like there's a societal pressure on kids right now. And so I've learned that watching what my kids have gone through, and I want people to be aware of this pressure and find ways to reduce the pressure on our young adults. So anyways, I want to talk about a headline that we see all too often in newspapers. And this is from the New York Times, and it says, his college knew of his despair, his parents didn't until it was too late. And this is the story of a college student who was becoming very depressed. He was failing his classes, and stopped attending classes. And the professors were getting very concerned about him. And they even said to one of the deans, you should call the parents. But the parents were never called until the student died by suicide on campus, and the parents were notified. This is such a terrible tragedy. This shouldn't happen, and we've got to do better as a society to identify these problems early. And I do believe both college mental health professionals and administrators need to think more about how they can collaborate with families when students are experiencing great distress or are in crisis. So today, my goals for this talk is that you learn about the escalating mental health problems on campus, that you learn about the evidence that family and social support improves recovery from mental health problems. And I want to talk about two laws, HIPAA and FERPA, that restrict parent involvement, but there are ways to deal with these laws where parents can get involved. And I want everyone here, whether they have a college student or another family member having a mental health problem, to learn how to overcome the major barriers to mental health care. The number one barrier is lack of access to care, lack of availability. And lastly, since we're at IHMC, I want to talk about some new technologies that are transforming the delivery of mental health care and that will promote greater wellness in the future. Okay. So when I talk about college mental health, people say, well, haven't college students always had problems with depression, and are mental health problems really going up in our society? Well, in our society as a whole, mental health problems, if you judge mental health problems by the rate of suicide, they actually are about the same as they were in the 1950s. Suicide rates peaked in the 1950s at about 13 in 100,000, and then they went down in 2000 and then started steadily going up again until the present day. So if you look at the general population, the suicide rates fluctuate, but they haven't changed that much. But what's concerning is suicide rates among 15 to 24-year-olds have gone up dramatically since the 1950s, and we are seeing more mental health problems in children and young adults. So the suicide rates have tripled since the 50s, and since the year 2000, they've gone up from 10 in 100,000 to 13 in 100,000. This is far too high. And you might wonder, why are suicide rates going up? Well, suicide is often associated with depression and sometimes with anxiety. And in college students in particular, depression has gone up dramatically. In a study of college students in which college students were screened for mental health disorders, 37% screened positive for depression, 31% for anxiety disorders, 37% had a lifetime diagnosis of a mental health disorder, and 23% took psychiatric medications in the last year. These increases are dramatic from 10 years ago. So, excuse me. So what is causing this increase in mental health problems? And after I'm done talking, I can't wait to hear from the college students here about what they think is causing the increase. But some studies show that perfectionism is part of the picture, this pressure to be perfect, and that can cause mental health problems. Perfectionism has gone up by 33% in the last 20 years, according to a large study of students in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. And the way I see what's going on, I see that the academic, social, and financial pressure has gone up dramatically. Only 40% of college students are academically prepared for college, and only 40% graduate in 4 years. And it's pretty stressful to go to college and not be ready. Financial pressure is sky high. On average, college students owe $30,000 after graduation, twice as much as they owed 20 years ago. The social pressure that may be the biggest pressure of all. And a big component of that social pressure is from social media. There's something called FOMO, fear of missing out. And it means that people are seeing their friends on social media having a great time and doing well and looking fantastic, and they feel they're just not good enough. And there was a study out of University of Pennsylvania where a group of college students were asked to reduce their social media use, and their rates of depression and loneliness decreased. So social media plays a big role. It can do good things, but then we also have to, I'd say, limit its use. But anyways, so what I'm going to talk about today is how parents can collaborate in treatment of college students. And I'm going to talk about studies a little later, but I want to give some actual examples that I've experienced. And when I talk about students, I'm going to talk about them in a general way. I'm not talking about any particular patient that I've treated. So one of the most important things a parent can do is recognize if their problem is having some symptoms of depression and anxiety, and they can encourage holistic treatment. And I wrote holistic treatment because I want you to know that I'm not a psychiatrist who thinks medication is the only thing that helps people. I understand, and studies show that lifestyle changes, therapy, and sometimes medication are critical in helping people recover from mental health problems. So parents just recognizing that and saying, I want you to go to the campus counseling center and talk with someone is what gets a lot of students in the door. Sometimes I've seen situations where students are, let's say, having severe anxiety. They're having panic attacks where their heart hurts so much they've gone to the emergency room and they just want to go home. They don't want to stay in school. So I've had situations where a parent will come up, say to the student, listen, you can get treatment and stay in school, and come to that very first appointment with the student, and we sit there and talk about the treatment that will help the student, and that's what gets some students in the door. So that's not helicoptering, that's intervening when it's necessary. And I've seen these students, again, go on to do well in school and graduate. So another role parents can take is providing information to the psychiatrist about developmental history. I might see a student that doesn't talk or is severely withdrawn, and I want to know, were they introverts their whole life? Were they ever diagnosed with social anxiety disorder or autism? Sometimes students can't provide that information, and I've had parents provide it. Parents are also critical in providing emotional support when things aren't going well. No student wants their parents to call 10 times a day. I've heard students complain about that. But if a student is experiencing depression and suicidal thoughts, I would recommend the parents check in with that student at least once a day and make sure they're okay. And even, I had a situation where a senior experienced a breakup right at the end of, like 3 weeks before graduation. And he got severely depressed and even suicidal. And I spoke with his mother, and I thought he should probably go into the hospital, but the mother said, no, I'll come stay with him, and I'll get him through this, and he can start medication and therapy. And he got through it and graduated. So there's a tremendous amount parents can do to help. And parents can also, I think it's really important for students to let parents know if they're starting treatment, specifically medication, so parents can give the students feedback and let them know, hey, I think you're doing better. I'm glad you're taking the medication. That's great. Or, wow, you're not doing that well now since starting the medication. You need to call your psychiatrist and let them know that you need to get seen sooner. So parents can also act as an early detection system if things aren't going well. And I gave an example of that. And most importantly, parents can take action during a crisis. Parents, if a student calls and says, I am having suicidal thoughts, the parents can call the school and get someone to check on that student. Or if the parents know the student is depressed and they can't reach them, again, they can get someone to check on them and even come. And actually, if a student is ever hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital, it's critical that the parents come pretty quickly because the student may only stay there 2 or 3 days. the stays are very short, and sometimes the student comes out feeling worse. So the parents need to be there to meet with the student and the outpatient therapist or psychiatrist and decide, does it make sense for the student to stay in school? Can you set up a support system in school? Or should the student go home and take a semester off? So parents are really critical in those kinds of decisions. Okay, so one thing I always get asked is, how can parents help their college students when they are legally adults? And this is a conundrum for parents of college students. They know they're not really, well, biologically, they aren't adults. They're still adolescents. The brain does not fully mature until people are age 25. So people can still be impulsive, and they're still learning how to make decisions. So, but they are legally adults. So there are two laws that I mentioned earlier, FERPA and HIPAA, that can bar parents from having access to children's information. And FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it doesn't allow parents to see grades. And I would say, if any of you have a child going to college, you should ask your college student to sign what's called a FERPA waiver form. And I actually, when my son went to college, the college wanted students to sign this, and that way parents can see end of semester grades. And I don't want parents to be tiger parents and demand all A's. What I do want parents to do is notice if there are very poor grades and help the student get help. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with students who failed the semester or did poorly and were not honest with their parents about the grades. The students were not bad people. They were embarrassed. They felt, I am an adult, I should be able to handle this. But often they need parents to sit down and say, okay, this is what needs to be done. You need to problem solve and talk about whether the student needs to meet with an advisor or go to the counseling center or get tested for a learning disability. But it's really important for parents to be involved in these issues. So the second form I mentioned is that, the second law is HIPAA, which restricts parents' rights to medical records or even the ability to speak with a mental health or medical provider. I think it's important if a student is seeing, let's say, a psychiatrist on campus, that they sign a HIPAA release of information form that allows the parents and the psychiatrist to speak. And I'll tell you why I think that. You never know when a student is going to have a much worsening course of depression. And when I start out working with a student with depression, I want to know that I will be able to talk with the parent if things aren't going well, or even if the student stops coming for treatment and I call the student and they don't call back and I don't know what's going on. So I think, and I've had situations where I've treated someone with a severe depression, they miss an appointment, they're not answering the phone, and I will call the parents. I mean, if the student has signed the HIPAA release of information form, I will call the parents and I will ask the parents to text them or make sure they're okay and let me know what's going on. So I think it's really critical for parents to talk with their children and say, I'd really like you to sign these forms. It doesn't mean for the HIPAA form that the psychiatrist is going to tell the parent everything about what they talk about in a session. It's really for urgent and emergency situations. And students can take away the form if they feel there's too much information is being revealed, or they can reverse the form. So, and even, I'm making all these recommendations about collaboration with parents, but there's actual evidence that when you have social support, you can have a better recovery from mental health problems. Just studies in general and all ages show that social support and a strong social network, having friends, actually decreases the rate of depression and suicidal thinking, and this cuts across all ages. In college students in particular, a study did show that parent support decreased the rate of suicidal thinking. A study from student health professionals showed that parent involvement in a problem-solving and a collaborative way with students in general reduces improves academic performance and also improves lifestyle choices in terms of not abusing drugs and alcohol. So parents checking in with their students can make a difference. If a student, there's something called the RAISE study, and it's a study of people who have first episode psychosis. Psychosis means losing touch with reality and hearing voices that aren't there or feeling paranoid that people are following you. And this can happen in young adults. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen. And if it does happen, it's very frightening for the college student. It's frightening for the family. But people can recover from psychosis with the right treatment. But it's critical they get comprehensive treatment quickly. And when I say comprehensive treatment, I mean medication, individual therapy, and family therapy. And this is what the study shows, that family therapy is really critical because psychosis, again, can get very bad if not treated and actually lead to self-harm. So, and other studies show that family and social support in general improve recovery after someone has been in a psychiatric hospital. So I hope I've convinced you that family involvement is really important when a college student, or in fact anyone, is experiencing a mental health problem. But when I've told this to people, they say, yeah, I'm a really involved parent, but it's hard to access mental health care. And one barrier that comes up is stigma that students can feel about having a mental health problem and seeking mental health care. And a study, the Healthy Mind study that I mentioned earlier, show 43% of college students perceive public stigma about mental health care. In other words, they don't mind going to see someone, but they're really afraid someone's going to find out, and that can keep them from going into a mental health provider's office. So I think it's really important for parents to say to a child starting in high school, sometimes people in the young adult years can develop depression and anxiety. They can feel down a lot and have trouble sleeping and eating. And those are some symptoms of depression. So a parent should say to the child, if you do feel low and you're not feeling yourself, it's good to speak with a therapist. And if you need medication, that's okay too. And again, we always want to start with therapy first, but sometimes people benefit from medication. And we know that the sooner someone gets treatment, the better. So we want that to reduce that stigma. But the biggest barrier to mental health care is a lack of access. And we know that a lot of students who have mental health problems don't have access to care. Only 53% of college students who screened positive for depression and anxiety actually got mental health treatment in the last year. So 47% did not get treatment. This is awful. And one of the big problems is there are not enough psychiatrists in this country. The number of doctors in the United States rose by 45% from 1995, but the number of psychiatrists only rose by 12%. And there's a major lack of funding for psychiatry residency training programs, and I think our government needs to address this issue. So where do we stand in Florida? And I'm not just talking about college students now in terms of mental health, but where do we stand in terms of access to mental health care in the state of Florida? We are number 46, that we're in the red there. And when they this study defined access to mental health care, they included having insurance or number of psychiatrists and those kinds of measures. So we need to do better in this state, much better. And how does the United States compare with other countries? Well, Switzerland is the gold standard for mental health care. They have far more psychiatrists per 100,000 people than we do. They have 35 versus 12 in the United States. Oh, sorry, I read the wrong statistic. They have 26 versus 14 in the United States. They also provide better care for the seriously mentally ill, and they have an average length of stay in the psychiatric hospital of 35 days versus 7 days in the United States. So we have got to do better in this country. And I actually am hopeful that with millennials now getting into politics and getting into office, millennials have experienced a higher rate of mental health problems, and I believe millennials will fund mental health care better in the future, so I am very hopeful about that. So getting back to college students, I mentioned there can be access issues, and I want to talk about how to find mental health care both on and off campus. Always start with campus resources. Go to the campus counseling center or the dean of students' office, and the student can find out what are the resources on campus. Parents can go online and look at the counseling center's websites. Now, most colleges have a counseling center. Only 50% have psychiatrists on campus. Some schools provide long-term therapy for 4 years. Some only provide about 10 sessions, so you have to see what the campus provides. Since a lot of colleges aren't providing long-term care, they are hiring case managers who will link college students to resources near campus, both therapists and psychiatrists, and they will sit with the student and look at their insurance and figure out the best place for the student to go, or if the student does not have insurance, they will find them someone who does a sliding scale. So if that doesn't work, a student might want to see a provider at home if they are in school close to home. And they could even see a primary care provider at home or on campus who can prescribe psychiatric medications. Some primary care providers are comfortable doing this, some are not. Now, the next step they can take, and I put question marks here because I think we need to see the studies to show how these things are working, but some people are starting to engage in telepsychiatry and teletherapy. And recently I had a patient who graduated and found a psychiatrist who was doing telepsychiatry. She never met the person face to face. And this is going to be a greater option in the future. It's not for everyone. If you have a patient who is having a lot of suicidal thoughts, doing psychiatry or therapy from 1,000 miles away is not the way to do things. It's really important to be in the room to evaluate the person and get a sense of how they're doing. And there's also something therapeutic about being in the room with someone and having that face-to-face contact. But telepsychiatry is going to be a force in the future for a lot of people. So as I wrap things up, I want to talk about the technologies that are transforming healthcare. And actually, a lot of places like British Columbia in Canada, they are using telemental health to meet the need of college students, and they approve funding for 24/7 access to mental health care through a virtual resource, through phone calls, online chats, emails, texts, and even virtual counseling sessions. And the Washington State in our country is looking at this as well, and I think that's pretty interesting. There's also something called the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. It's an online resource that you can access. You can Google this, and it's a great screening test for suicide that people can use on their family members. It doesn't substitute for seeing a therapist, but if a family member expresses suicidal thoughts, it's okay for a family member to say, listen, I want to ask you a few questions because I want to know if this is an emergency and we need to get emergency care, or if this can wait, but you must see a therapist. And anyone having suicidal thoughts, even if they don't intend to harm themselves in the near future, that's a sign that you need help from a therapist or a psychiatrist. So that's an online resource. There are really great apps online that treat anxiety. Headspace, Calm, and Breathe. Headspace and Calm are billion-dollar mindfulness meditation companies. They teach this. And Headspace is trying to get FDA approval where you can prescribe Headspace for treatment. And I've heard students love these resources. I'm not saying they can replace everything, but they're a great resource. Artificial intelligence, I just found out IHMC is doing some studies and studying how people are texting or talking to assess whether they're manic or depressed. And I've heard of other people looking at artificial intelligence and looking at what people are texting on their phones to assess how they're doing and if they need to call their doctor sooner. Very briefly mention ketamine, which is actually an old medicine that is being used newly to treat acute suicidal thinking, but some people are using it in the emergency room to reverse suicidal thinking. The problem is it's a very dangerous chemical drug. It's an anesthetic, and it has to be delivered in a very safe way in a medical setting. But anyways, it's something people are looking at. And there are non-medication treatments, and one that's really showing promise is neuromodulation treatment called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where magnetic stimulation is applied externally. It's not an invasive treatment. You go for an hour every day to a clinic and get this treatment, and it's great for treatment-resistant depression, and insurance is starting to cover this treatment. So I put up I know I've talked about a lot of heavy topics, and I want to put up resources if anyone needs help now or in the future, or if your family member needs help. The centers in the Vines in Marion County offer a 24-hour call-in service and also a 24-hour walk-in service if people are in distress. There's a suicide prevention helpline up there and a suicide prevention chat line. And I just found out about something called the Freedom Clinic that offers mental health care in Ocala for the uninsured. So it's great to see these resources expanding in Marion County. So I'm going to end my part of the talk with some recommendations. Recommendations you can give to your college student to be successful in general in college, and which can help them overcome any kind of mental health problem. The 3 secrets to college success are people, purpose, and positivity. I've already talked about the role of people in improving mental health, and having a sense of social belonging actually improves your GPA. Studies have shown this. Purpose is critical in getting through the tough times. And Viktor Frankl wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning that talks about this at length, the meaning of purpose in our lives. And positivity, many studies have shown that grit and resilience and positive thinking help students succeed in college, knowing that if they fail, they can overcome this, and it's not the end of the world. And parents really need to reinforce that positive mindset in their children. So anyways, I just put up my website, my email, marciamorrismd@gmail.com, if you have any questions about anything I've said. And if you want to learn more about college mental health and what parents can do, my book, The Campus Cure, is available through Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And I just want to end by wishing all of you and your families good mental health and wellness for the coming year. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Marcia. Okay, so we have our IHMC toy. So the rules are that I'll toss you the mic. You can toss it back, and you can throw it around, but be kind to me when you throw it back to me. Christy is right here in the back, so we're going to take questions from back and front. So Christy and I will be tossing the ball around. So I'm going to go here first. We see you right there. So here I'm going to go first.
Were you talking to this thing?
Yep.
Ms. Morris, I enjoyed your talk, but if I can change lanes a little bit on you here, something that really is distressing me about suicide is the VA tells us 22 of our young people that are coming back from combat are committing suicide. And I was just curious if you have any comments on that, on what you think could be done.
Well, it is very distressing, and our service people deserve the very best mental health care. I actually know some people who work at the VA at University of Florida, and they are telling me that the VA has hired case managers to reach out to people who may not come for appointments. They're working on increasing the number of psychiatrists and therapists, and they're also using some form of artificial intelligence to review charts of veterans and look for signs and symptoms of increasing distress to see if they need more outreach or even need to go into the hospital. And so they are very aware of this awful situation, and they're making efforts to improve the situation. And I hope it does get better soon. Yeah.
Hey, Marcia.
Hey.
Back years ago when I was in med school, 25, 30 years ago, there was a big emphasis on making a pact with your child that they would promise you that they would not commit suicide without calling you and talking to you. Did that, you didn't mention anything about that. Did that pan out to be?
I haven't heard of that. I think perhaps a better, well, I do think it's a topic that parents should talk about with their young adults. Even if it comes up in the news, like we had the suicide of Kate Spade, that's an opening to talk about suicide and how it's so sad that she died, and there is help out there. And again, one thing I talk about in my book and on my blog are signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety disorders. I think parents need to go over that with their kids and say, if you feel this way, let me know. So even before it gets to the suicidal thinking, you want the kids to come to you if they are experiencing any depression and start getting help early so they don't reach that point of having suicidal thinking. But something like 15% of high school students have considered suicide in a year's time. So it's out there, and parents need to ask their kids and say, are you okay if they see they're in distress? It is okay to ask your young adult child or young adult if you see they're in distress, you can ask them, do you feel like hurting yourself? It will not cause them to hurt themselves. It will help open up a dialogue. Okay.
Pardon me for not standing. I'm a 76-year-old grandfather and a bit of a skeptic. Throughout your presentation, you have focused on dialogue, conversation, outreach by students to parents and others. I've just returned from 5 weeks of archaeological dig with 12 young people, Canadians and Americans, in the 20 to 30 age range. It's been I've never experienced a group of people who have been so unable to communicate in my entire life. Now, you can throw up all sorts of reasons for that, but my concern would be that these people are setting themselves up to do exactly what you recommend, to do exactly the opposite of what you recommend, and that is to retain it amongst themselves. Have you any thoughts on young people today, the millennials, and their inclination to deal remotely with people rather than interactive communication?
Well, and actually, yeah, there are studies in college students that show people are you having less face-to-face contact and more social media contact. And I see that in the freshmen. A lot of them may not have the social skills that people had in the past. So I think it's critical for parents of middle and high school students to restrict and set time limits. There are programs that set time limits on social media use. Well, no, I have a cousin, he's a coach of academic coach of high school students. He told me about this app he uses with his own daughter that it does restrict the time. And parents, we're not perfect and kids find ways around, but we do need to make sure people are getting out, doing sports, socializing face to face. I know it's not easy. Keeping my son off video games when he was younger was a hard task, but we have to make the effort. Yes, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Frederick. I was wondering, you mentioned how somewhat arbitrary the decision that 18-year-olds are legally adults was, and how mentally humans are not fully matured until about age 25. Have there been any campaigns to change, at least for some laws like HIPAA, the legal adulthood from 18 to something a little bit higher?
I've heard people talk about this, but I have mixed feelings about it. I would rather the student voluntarily sign the HIPAA form. Here's the problem. There are some students who come from abusive homes, so their parents not having access is important. We don't want their parents to have access to grades or their mental health or medical records. So, but that's a small percentage. The large percentage, I think, do come from supportive homes. So I personally don't necessarily want to see the law change, although some people do, and some colleges are really pushing those students to sign the FERPA waiver forms. But I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, Sydney.
Yes, so my question, Dr. Morris, is what do you think of the role of social emotional learning for children in school as an intervention and as prevention?
Well, when you say social emotional learning, give me an example. What do you mean?
Well, I teach a curriculum in social emotional learning, and I
Okay.
actually teach it at the prison for felons. I mean, I have a group of
Wow.
25 guys that I do
Yeah.
this work with. And over, they say, if I just learned these things when I was a kid, I wouldn't be here. And it's emotional regulation. It's how to
Yes.
read your own emotions and how to understand other people's.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I haven't worked with the younger kids, but I think that's a great idea. And I've heard of people teaching, for example, yoga in schools, which teaches that mindfulness meditation and how to quiet the mind. So I think teaching those skills, and even teaching more about mental health in the schools is good. I think another way to approach this, though, is to reduce some of that academic pressure. I do think kids are getting pushed to do things, academic things at a young age that they're not necessarily emotionally ready to do. And I think we need to make sure they're getting exposed to arts, music, phys ed. I think that the phys ed teaches kids how to work in teams. That's where the social skills that were mentioned before may be lacking. They're so focused on academics, they're not doing these other things that teach them how to interact with others. Yeah.
Morris. I have a grandson who started his freshman year last fall at the RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, and he was challenged. And I think there were several reasons, but I believe he got into a very depressed state, which affected his academic performance.
Yeah.
But RIT seems to be offering a program with much more guidance where they require him to attend certain types of classes that do you find other colleges are developing these programs to help kids get through that transitional freshman year?
Well, you bring up a good point about helping people get through the freshman year and trying to do more early. Some schools I heard are requiring students to take stress management classes for credit. You brought up something that I wasn't sure if you were saying they were requiring him to do some kind of treatment, because some schools do mandate treatment, but there are questions about the legality of that and whether it's beneficial. I mean, we want to convince students that treatment will help, but it's good that he's getting that help and that they care enough to recommend it at that school. I think that's great.
This is the coolest mic ever. Can we get one of these? Giveaway? Hey, one of those first slides, Doc, that you showed gave the impression that suicide is flat since 1950?
Well, it's not flat. It went down it was up in the 50, went down in 2000, and from 2000, it's been on a steady rise.
So it is on the rise, because
Yeah.
we feel it out here that it is definitely on the rise.
Yes,
it's a crisis.
by what we hear, it is, and it's. That's why people came up with that Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, because we all see this increase and we want to give the community tools to help. But it was highest in the 1930s during the Great Depression, which makes sense. But we can do better as a society to get the suicide rates down, I think.
Was that percentage for all age and population?
Well, it was for all age
students?
and population. They separated out men versus women. Men were on the higher. Men actually die by suicide at a 3 times higher rate than women. Men are more likely not to talk about their problems and take dramatic action like that. So that brings up a whole other issue of reaching our boys and teaching them how to talk about their feelings and get help. Yeah.
And are there any reasons that are behind all these stats that perhaps potentially we just don't want to talk about publicly, or they're not politically correct, that could be driving some of the reasons why we're seeing our young people take their lives?
Well, I mean, I mentioned some of the reasons I think the different pressures. There could be other reasons. It could be family structure. I've seen young adults very cynical about the world in a way that I wasn't at their age. I'm not saying religion solves everything, but a lot of young people are disillusioned with religion. And in the past, I thought that used to maybe help people get through some of the tough times. And I'm not saying religion will fix everything, but we need to find a way to give our young people hope and not be so cynical about the future.
And my last question would be, you know how you talked about how it seems that we're pushing our students academically to be superior, but then at the same token, the statistic that you showed said that they're not ready for college. How do those two come together and make sense?
Well, there are students getting into the top universities who have, we have a maybe disjointed group, but we have this group that have perfect SAT scores, who have 10 AP classes, and we didn't see, when I went to college, that didn't happen that much. There's a segment that are being pushed, and there may be a segment that's also being left behind. So maybe it's a little bit of both, because I do think our education system definitely needs a boost and more funding in this country. And so you're right, like the kids who aren't academically, there are the kids who are very prepared who get depressed because they can't get all A pluses, but then there are the kids who aren't prepared, who are depressed because they're failing their classes. So there's that dichotomy that I see. I do see that on campus.
And then the lady who has the social, don't leave, I want to talk to you.
Oops, yeah. So I actually had a question. I'm wondering if a lot of some of the suicides are not actually just becoming romanticized with social media and TV shows like 13 Reasons Why.
Yeah.
And if there wasn't something that maybe we can do to promote it as, don't find this romantic, it's not romantic, is there anything that we can maybe do for that?
Well, there's actually, I'm trying to remember what website, it might be NAMI, which is a mental health group. There are recommendations for the media how to report suicides and to not romanticize it or give a lot of details or even talk about the method, because studies have shown after suicides of famous people like Marilyn Monroe and Judy Garland from years ago, but suicide rates went up when those suicides were sensationalized. So what's recommended if there is a public figure dies by suicide, to briefly mention it, but then talk about what are the signs and symptoms of depression? Where can you get resources? Like give people helpful information, because that can trigger people. You're right about that. And it has to be discussed in a very careful way.
Can I say something really quick? You've got the mic. I do, I know, but she has to turn it on. So I study this. So this is part of my research, is looking at social media.
Oh, okay, so you're the one who's doing
me.
the social.
And interestingly, we have some evidence that suicide rates did not spike and went down after Kate Spade's suicide.
Okay, see, I didn't mention that because I don't know what happened with that, and maybe the media handled it really well.
Right,
yeah.
and we've seen a clear change in how the media speaks about dying by suicide, and that's been amazing to watch.
That is really heartening.
I mean,
hear.
it's sad that we have to watch it, right? But and of course we just want those rates to drop, but. We are seeing some effects, so I just wanted to
that's good news.
add that's coming out.
Yeah.
And then I'll pass it to the actual question.
So my question is, when it relates to family, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that it takes a family, and that sometimes young people do not have very great family structures.
That's right.
With the drug epidemic, with just distance in which families live.
Yeah.
Young people who are at school, at universities, they may come from very disenfranchised, dysfunctional families.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about some of the resources that are available whenever the family is not intact and it's not a safe place to be for that young person?
And we do see that sometimes. And on campus, they have, sometimes they're called care managers or success coaches, but they almost act like parents where they'll check in with the student every week and make sure they're keeping up with academics and do some parental things like suggest joining certain clubs. So campuses have developed people who almost act like parents. And for students who are, let's say, first generation, whose parents didn't go to college, most schools have mentorship programs for those students. But I feel like they need even more mentorship, yeah.
When I went to university, there were professors that took me under their wing.
That's great.
And there were administrators that singled out students that they saw that were in trouble. Yeah. And I don't know if that's happening as much sometimes at a large institution like UF. There's so many students. Just wondering if there is that type of network that still exists.
I think there is, because anecdotally, students have told me how compassionate professors are if they need to delay an exam. They might need to say, I'm having a mental health problem. So I've seen a shift in professors being more understanding of those issues. And so I think that's good. But I think you identified an important issue. If they don't have that supportive family, there has to be a creation of another network for them, because they need that. They need the advice and support.
Basic question. Is that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Every 8-year-old learns when you have sniffles and a fever, you get antibiotics. And by the time they go to college, they know that. And the parents know that as well. Mm-hmm. How do young people know when they get to college that they might be experiencing some kind of mental health disorder? Because we don't teach them that from the time they're 8 years old.
We need to teach, and I'm 8 or 10. I'm not sure they're quite ready to learn it. They might be, but maybe in middle school, they need to. There needs to be more education. We talk about, they have these classes on drug education, sex education. We've got to do more mental health education. Actually, I had the opportunity to speak at Forest High School to students in the program, Take Stock in Children program, and I was so excited. I was invited to speak to the students, parents, and mentors about mental health. So I think mental health professionals need to get out there more and also do more education. I think that's critical.
Last question? 2 more questions, JK. I'm sorry, you're in line though, I see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I just want to piggyback on actually the last 2 questions. I work for the Boys and Girls Club, and I know all too well that many of those children don't have the ideal support system at home, and we want to encourage them to be everything that they have the potential to be anyway. I'm wondering, is it possible for college students to be able to put somebody on their records that could be contacted that is not a parent or a family member?
I have students who don't want their families involved, and they put their roommate or a friend. Yeah, so I've had or an aunt. So it doesn't have to be the parents. It can be anyone. It can be any support system. Yeah.
I just want to say there are some groups that are targeting the 6 to 12-year-old age group for mental health awareness and trying to teach them how to be emotionally aware and cognitive of what they're experiencing and feeling so that they are more apt to know when to seek help. So I just wanted to piggyback on that. Thank you.
That's great. That's great.
So in my training, I've dealt with a few attempts of suicide. And in the training, it specifically talked about communicating back to them and ask them a direct question. Are you thinking about committing suicide? Do you agree with that direct questioning, direct line of questioning?
That's a tough question to answer because, I mean, I evaluate people for suicide all the time in my work, but if someone says, yeah, they've made an attempt, you ask a series of questions about whether they past attempts, are they having thoughts currently, do they have a plan, and is the plan imminent? And we ask about protective factors too, because there are protective factors like, what keeps you from harming yourself? They might say, I don't want to hurt my family. It's against my religion. That actually does keep some people from harming themselves. So are you in the mental health field? I couldn't tell what you were saying. No, but I mean, so actually we go through a whole series of questions. In terms of family members, I think if you look at that Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale, that might answer some of your questions about how to approach it. But it is just fine to ask directly. Yeah, that won't cause anyone to hurt themselves. Oh, in the classroom? Oh. Yeah. Oh. Right. And then you can ask them and then get them to a mental health professional who can more thoroughly evaluate the situation. Yes. But yeah, asking is fine. Yeah.
Okay, y'all. I'd like to thank Marcia for being with us tonight.